from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
This is Emilye Crosby on December 9, 2015 with Judy Richardson, and we're in her home in Silver Spring, Maryland, outside of DC, and we're here with the Civil Rights History Project, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and also with us are John Bishop and Guha Shankar. Judy, thank you so much for doing the interview with us.
Thank you.
Can you start by telling us when and where you were born and about your family?
I was born on March 10th, 1944 in Tarrytown, New York, which is about 45 miles north of New York City. My mother, May Louise Richardson, initially Tucker, was first a seamstress and then a homemaker, married to my father, and my father was and also she was a jazz pianist, but I can get to that in a minute. Yeah. Oh, honey, played a mean jazz piano. But my father was William King Richardson, and he grew up in the house that I grew up in and that he married and took my mother to in Tarrytown, in the Under the Hill section, it's called that, of Tarrytown, which is where all the blue-collar folks lived, right near the railroad tracks. My father had helped to organize the United Auto Workers Local in what was called the plant, which was the Fisher Body Chevrolet plant, where my father and the fathers of everybody I knew worked. And you could tell time from the shifts changing at the plant. And I found out only after my older sister saw one of the many documentary series that Black Side had done, After Eyes on the Prize, and it was on the Depression. And the beginning segment of that was on the beginnings of the Ford factory. And that was the first segment. And she saw all of the archival material from that and what it looked like in the plant. And she called me and she said, "Oh, I just saw, Black Sides." And it reminded me of when Daddy was organizing the local. And this is news to me. So I said, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, Daddy, was working in the plant." And she said there were times when he had decided he wanted to organize a union and the UAW local there. And so she said my sister remembered was that when the guy from the National, he was a white guy, and so he would come up and sit in my kitchen talking to my father. And what my sister said was that my mother would immediately close the curtains, because we were ground level. We had a little teeny tiny little house right on the ground there. And she said she would immediately close the curtains so that nobody could see that my father was talking to somebody from the local, from the National, because she was afraid, of course, with good reason, that he might lose his job.
Do you have a sense of the timing of this?
Not really. I mean, I have no memory of it. And so it would have had to be when he dies on the assembly line when I'm 7 years old. He dies of a heart attack. And so that would have been probably 53, 4 and 7 is 11, 51. So I was 7 years old then. And the other thing she remembers about this is that sometimes people would leave bags of groceries on our porch because they would be too afraid to overtly say they were supporting the local and the building of the organizing of the local. But the way they did that was to then give my family some groceries, And so my sister Karita said, you would come down outside and you would find these bags of groceries on the porch. And the result was that, as one of the white guys in Tarrytown mentioned to me when we were protesting segregated housing, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "We loved Billy, my father," which they did. They loved Billy. Now, they wouldn't allow him in some other stuff, but they loved Billy because he was treasurer of that local when he died of a heart attack on the line, in 51. So yeah, there's all of that.
So your dad's helping to organize a union that's mostly white? I mean, is he one of the...
No, because Tarrytown had I would say about a 10% Black population.
Okay.
And like all of the white ethnics on our block, because my block, there was the projects down the road, and that was just about all Black. And then on our block, which again was under the hill, so nobody had any money, but they were all working class, my family, and then the working class white people on the block, Italians, Polish, and Irish. And so in addition though, and I should mention by the way that Tarrytown was steeped in tradition. So I went to Washington Irving Junior High School. This was Washington Irving territory. Washington Irving Junior High School, Sleepy Hollow High School. Yes, our mascot was the Headless Horseman, Go Horseman Go. It was all of that. I mean, we had, but I didn't see any middle class, certainly no middle class black people, but no middle class white people either, because it hadn't become that kind of suburban thing. There were white people who lived in Sleepy Hollow Manor and Tappan Zee Manor, something like that. But most of the people I knew, and certainly all my friends, were white kids, some black kids, but mainly white kids whose father worked in the plant. The black people I knew, their mothers mainly, their fathers worked in the plant too, and their mothers oftentimes worked out, so they were domestic workers. Yeah.
Well, so when people are saying to you, "We love Billy, why are you doing this?" kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
that's because you're protesting segregation.
Segregated housing, but also on my block, at the end of my block was a fire department. And it was all volunteers, it's Tarrytown, and so they had none of the fire departments had any black people. So when I come back from SNCC, that first summer, which would have been the summer of 64, somewhere in there, not only have we already started a Tarrytowners for Civil Rights, but also with this wonderful black couple, who was a doctor. I may or may not remember her name. She and her husband, both black. She was the doctor, and he was an architect. And they moved on Broadway, and that was major. I mean, when I went back to speak at Marymount College in Tarrytown, they came, as did a number of former folks from Tarrytowners for Civil Rights. And I went up to her husband, and I said, "Oh my gosh, you were the first black couple to actually make it to Broadway, And he said, all the black people told us that, so, so it was great, yeah. So we're doing stuff around residential, but it's also specific to that fire department. Now, when we pull a picket line, it's on the end of my block, right? 133 Franklin Street was my town, right? Was my address. At the end of that block, we had a picket line, and it was at a corner where all the commuters, because there were commuters. I just didn't know any of them because they were white and middle class. But they would come through that when they got off the train, because we're right across from the train, right? So they would see the picket line, and we had thrown it up because, they blackballed, and they said that. We blackballed, And I remember one guy coming, what? Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for if young people don't know what blackball?
Yes, good point. Blackballed, and during the certain times when we were trying to rearrange the language, we started calling it whiteballed. But blackballed meant that you did not, one blackball, it was kind of like you would put, well, I guess in terms of the fire department, it meant that if there was any nay vote on a proposed person who would be invited in to be part of this volunteer fire department, then somebody would either put a black ball or put a black, piece of paper, something to indicate nay. But the ball, it was oftentimes, I guess how it started was that it would be a ball. It would be some little black ball that would mean that was a no vote.
And they did that automatically with any black applicant?
Yes. And what they reminded me of, and this was while I'm on the picket line, they reminded me that, first of all, yes, we loved Billy, but also that when our house caught fire, Thanksgiving Day, and we had gone out of town to my father's family, and in Yonkers, nearby, came back and found smoldering. I mean, it was just, and one of them, my mother reminded me of this. She said that one of the firemen who loved Billy said, said, I stopped one of the other firemen from using a hatchet on the door because I said, no, this is Billy's house. And I'm sure he did that. because that was separate, you know. So yeah, it was smoldering. You know, I remember we all, you know, were in there. It was cold because we couldn't put any heat on, and you know. But eventually, you know, it got back to whatever, and it didn't burn down. It just was very smoldering, and we couldn't have any heat. And it was Thanksgiving and cold and stuff. Yeah. So anyway, there were fond memories of my father, and we also picketed again after I come back from that first stint. In SNCC, so I'm taking a break. We're fundraising for SNCC, and it must have been, I can't remember if it was before or after the 64 Summer Project in Mississippi, but certainly we're doing some kind of fundraising. And so I bring Stokely, the Freedom Singers, so Bernice and Chuck and Rutha, and I don't know who the other, who was the other in that original group? It wasn't Matthew. Who's the other guy? Oh, and Cordell. Yeah, Cordell. Hello. So they come up and so Stokely speaks. Now this is before Black Power, so it's 64. Stokely speaks, the SNCC Freedom Singers sing, and it's in Patriots Park in front of the library. There was a woman, Mrs. Kenny, who was as right-wing as you could get her. And so she protested about how in Patriots Park, there were these communists, you know, singing these songs, and we all know they were communists. She had written a letter saying that SNCC was a communist, well, basically, what did they used to call them? Not supporters, sympathizer, yeah. And so she put this in the Tarrytown Daily News. Now, my mother wrote, I mean, she had a beautiful handwriting. I mean, it was gorgeous. My mother had like an 8th grade education. Right. She read everything. Every Sunday it was Meet the Press on the television. It was, I remember she had stacks of the New York Post, which then was a real newspaper, right? And she would love Mary Kempton's articles because he was a little leftist. He was a liberal, basically. And so she had all of these stacks in her bedroom. And she would write back to Mrs. Kenny in the Tarrytown Daily News and say, no, and very rational. Mrs. Kenny at one point said something about, which I had to respond to, but had said something about, we know that they are communist sympathizers because it was read into the congressional record. And it's like, you could read the phone book into the congressional record, but she didn't know any better. So there was always that kind of, it's kind of like the Tea Party now, but my mother would, respond. And then I have letters from her, where she's saying that I should be careful and not, be around people because I'm going to get a cold. And she said, stay away from anybody who's sneezing because I've just realized that's part of what got lost at that Duke interview. Gosh. Anyway, but I have the original letter from her where she talks about, staying away from anybody who's cold, who has a cold and is sneezing. And then she says, now, of course, I'm in Mississippi and it's 1964. And she's talking about worry about the people who are sneezing because they may give you a cold, right? And then
really thinking about.
Well, then her next line is something about, I got to get to bed now. I haven't been sleeping well. And it was only after I got grown and looked at this letter, not back then, that I realized she's not sleeping because she's worried sick about me, right? But she's not saying any of that in the letter. And she says in the letter something about, and Keita, my sister, Karita, is cooking, can't do Thanksgiving dinner because she's organizing parties. Now, the parties were that I had brought my sister in, and my sister was now organizing the Harry Belafonte parties in '64 on Long Island out of the SNCC fundraising office in New York City. And so my sister, who could really cook, unlike my mother, my sister could cook. And so she was usually could do the turkey, but no, she's doing the Belafonte concerts. So, yeah.
So I want to go back just a
Yes.
little. I took you on a side.
Sorry, no, I go off,
with,
yes.
But so you found out later from your sister that your father was an organizer.
Yes.
And he died on the line when you were 7.
Mm-hmm.
And what was your mother doing?
Yes, good point. So my mother, at some point, my mother could play piano. I mean, she could hear something and could just do chords. And so she had written music. She certainly read scores and stuff, but sheet music. And she loved Porgy and Bess. She had all that sheet music in the bench. But in addition, she could play all kinds of things. And she loved, Oscar Peterson, and she just loved lots of people. So, not Oscar Peterson, Art Tatum. She loved Art Tatum. So, for her own amusement, she is doing this. But before I'm born, she was the pianist in a little jazz combo in Westchester County, which is where Tarrytown was. And so she was going around playing as the pianist with this Teddy Whiteley orchestra until my father stopped it. And I guess he didn't want his wife going off when he was not there on site, and off to these little clubs and stuff. So,
jazz,
you got it. A little free, yes. Although my mother was so prim. But anyway, so so in any event, so she's not doing that, but she still always played. I mean, I always remember my mother playing, to the point that when I come back from, and I got to tell you about the numbers because she also booked numbers. But when I come back from 64 from Mississippi, she's sitting in our little living room on the bench and in front of the piano, and it was a Lester little small piano, and she said, "Come here," and I go over and I sit next to her on the bench, and she started playing "We Shall Overcome" with these blue chords. I still remember it. It's like it brought tears to me. It was like, oh my little mommy. It's like it was so cute. It was so cute. And they were so gorgeous. I mean, I had never heard "We Shall Overcome" that way. It was just gorgeous. Yeah. And she had heard it. It wasn't like she was reading, sheet music. She just heard the chords, And so also though, what my mother did was that she booked numbers. So since she wasn't playing in the orchestra anymore, and she booked numbers for everybody. Now I'm in an ethnic neighborhood, right? So, and the mayor is Italian, Mayor Vetrano. Well, his mother used to come down from up the hill, and she would come down and she would book the numbers, not every day. Some people did it every day, but she booked it every so often. And then, walk back up the hill and stuff. And a lot of the people booked numbers with my mother, or my father also booked it at the plant. And then Trippy, who was this tall white guy, Trippy was the runner. So he would bring in the slips, he would take the money, and I think people felt comfortable doing it with my mother because she was honest as hell, as was my father. Now, my sister told me that my father once got arrested and had the number slips on him. And my sister said she was so embarrassed because it was in the Tarrytown Daily News. Yes. And now what was funny about that was everybody booked with my father. So somebody must have wanted something, somebody didn't get a payoff, something, because it was like the Italian folk, the Irish folk, the Italians, Irish, Polish folks, everybody booked with my father, so. And
this is gambling.
Oh, I'm sorry. Now, the numbers, I just found out recently that it was otherwise known as the, what did they use? The Italian lottery. So if you look it up, and some people suggest that it came in through the Italian immigrants who first come in. But, so it is otherwise known as that, but the numbers were based, the ones I knew, were based on the race and certain races that were being played that day. And so it was a 3-digit number. You could combinate it, you could do, 453, 354, however. And it was called boxing it, and it was simple enough so that people could understand it, but I didn't quite get all of the stuff around it. I just knew it was based on that day's race, didn't know how, which in that day's race, and that people would then come to collect, if they won the numbers. And so, and then, my mother would get a cut off whatever, particularly if somebody won who had bet with her. Mm-hmm. And then people would tip you and, all this stuff. One time my mother bet, And I always remember this because she told me this story. She said she won, and she then called my Aunt Helen, her sister, who lived in the Bronx. They were close. I mean, they were so close that every day I would call my Aunt Helen, Olinville 44986. I would call her every night because my mother would say, call Helen. And I'd go, okay, close, close. My mother wins. And she then calls my Aunt Helen and says, Helen, get ready. I'm going to pick you up. We're going to go buy some fur coats. So she and my mother got these fur coats from whatever my mother had played and won. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of work did your mother do after your father died?
Well, you know, I mean, it was great, first of all, when my father died. Now, they're hearing your questions, right? Okay, fine. After he died, what was great about the unions, of course, is that there were pensions for the family. So my mother has a modicum of you know, a small amount, but she also knows she has to work. As a matter of fact, let me tell you what she does with that small amount of money, because she realized she needed a car. And so she was going to buy a car and, you know, pay for it over time. The only one of the two times that I had ever seen my mother talk about race was this time when she goes to buy a car. It was going to be a Valiant. And she buys this, she goes and comes back, and she is huffing mad because the man is obviously, the white salesman has obviously disrespected her and suggested that she does not have the money to buy this. She comes back. She takes all of the money out that would, for the, not just a down payment, but to pay for the car outright, and gives it to the man. So that, you know, it was an inroad in whatever might have been there. But that money was there because, you know, they didn't spend much money on stuff, but also because, you know, there was a UAW pension that just went to her. However, that wasn't enough. And so she then gets a job. Oh, well, first of all, she goes for, you had to get on a list, so you had to take an exam. Now, my mother was very smart. She had an 8th grade education, but she was really smart and corrected my grammar. Because, I mean, I would say, well, he went with Henry and me. She said, no, with Henry and I. She said, me. Henry and me. She always, it's the preposition. She knew the parts of the, you know, it was all of that. So even now, I correct my grammar based on my mother standing over my shoulder, right? But, so she knew all this stuff, but she kept getting low marks, and you had to be in the top whatever number to be considered for a county job. She goes to Mr. Slavin, who ran the drugstore, and says to Mr. Slavin, you know, I can't seem to get hired. She said, it seems to me that I'm coming up at the top of the exam, but nobody's calling me for work. He says, Mr. Slavin says, how are you registered? And she says, Democrat. She says, you got to change your registration, be a Republican. And she does, and I always remember this, immediately she gets called. She goes, and so then she becomes a county worker as a secretary at the county office building in White Plains. So she's doing that every day. Yeah.
You said one of only 2 times your mother talked about
Oh,
race.
good pickup, yes, which I would not have remembered, so thank you. The other time was when she mentioned going to see Birth of a Nation in whatever that would have been, 1915 or something, during President Wilson's presidency. And she said that she went, and for those who don't know, the Birth of a Nation was based on the book, should I go through all that? Or yeah, okay. Based on a book written by a Klansman, and it valorized the Klan and just said, you know, basically they were the protectors of white womanhood after Reconstruction, and that's the reason white people were safe in the South. Okay, so and they absolutely make horrible. They make it's the whole coon thing and ignorant and rapists as the former enslaved people. So. But what film courses do with this film is that they really teach it as for the technique, because it was a new technique. And sometimes they don't even mention how racist it was. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've gone to film departments, and okay, so I know about this. But what she remembered was that she had gone with a friend of hers, and she said she saw the way that black people were portrayed. And by the way, I should mention that, well, I'm sorry, the way they were portrayed. And she said, I couldn't even lift my head. She said, we came out of that theater and all I could do was look down at the pavement. I was so ashamed. Never talked about the larger issue of racism or any of that, just that was the incident, that's what I learned. Now, I later find out when we're doing Eyes on the Prize, and I mentioned to John Dittmer, I said, I saw this when I was the only black person in my AP history course at Sleepy Hollow High School, right? And I loved the course, but we were doing something on Reconstruction. And I said of course it was, just a short piece on Reconstruction, but it was so negatively portrayed. And in fact, the only illustration was the one that came from Birth of a Nation, which I find out, but I didn't know what that was. I just knew it was an illustration and it showed what was supposed to be a white scalawag, and they were, the black guy was disheveled and he had his feet on the desk of the, what was supposed to be the state legislature during Reconstruction. And you see the white guy who's come down from the north, and he looks horrible, and the whole framing of it was as a really negative thing. So you didn't get anything about South Carolina, first time you get free public education for poor whites as well as black people, all that. So I mentioned it's Eyes on the Prize School. It's say Eyes 1 would have been somewhere around mid-'80s. And one of our advisors was John Dittmer, who does Local People, right? But hadn't done it yet. And so I say to John, John, I remember this book, and it had this illustration in it of what was supposed to be Black Reconstruction. And I said, when we looked at it and you saw that horrible caricature, all I remember is the white kids in my class kind of looking back at me, kind of trying not to look, but always looking back. And I felt really ashamed. As my mother had with the same, imagery. Same imagery, that's it. So I say, and the thing is, what they were denied was the same thing I was denied, which was the reality of what Black Reconstruction really was. And the sense that I got coming out of that, which was, this is what happens when Black people are put into any position of authority or control, right? So I get that message, all my white classmates get that, so I asked John Dittmer, what, am I remembering this? And he said, oh yeah. And he remembered the authors, and he said that was a nationally prescribed textbook at the time. So other people are getting this, So anyway, I can't remember how I started out. Oh, because that's the other part of that, was that imagery. So it's never just a film. People will tell me, why are you getting so upset? Like with Mississippi Burning, why are you getting so upset? It's just a film. It's never just a film, So yeah.
So you've covered a lot of different things about growing up, but I remember talking once and you telling me you wrote a letter to the editor about the Little Rock desegregation.
Yes, I did. I forgot that. Yes. Okay, so I'm in high school, so somewhere between 10th grade and 12th grade. So, wait, 57. Okay, so 57, 44, what is that, 13? Something weird. Okay. And I remember writing a letter, which was to tell the Tarrytown Daily News, I don't know why these students in Little Rock are trying to get into this white school. They're better off just pursuing their education however they want, because it's really about education, and we will progress through that, So, oh, how far we've come.
You were desegregating your school in Tarrytown.
Yes,
right?
exactly. That's right. Exactly. That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was, until I get to SNCC.
Do you know where you're getting that attitude from?
It could have been my mother. It could have been, but I should not blame my mother for this. It could have been other folks in the school. Since that's what I got when I'm at Swarthmore, a good Quaker college, when we're doing the desegregating, and good Quaker children are saying to us, you'd be better off not doing any demonstrating, but staying on campus and just pursuing your education. As one of the students said to somebody else, they would be better doing that because they'll be, how did he put it? Because they will be able to contribute more to their race. That was the thing, yes. So, that was the general line of thinking of most people most white people, and some black people too, but most white people. So I can see that I would have incorporated that, given that I'm sitting there. Yeah.
Do you ever want to look him up and compare how much you've contributed and he's contributed?
Oh, that one, no. No, forget him. Exactly.
So let's jump ahead, and you just mentioned you go to college at Swarthmore.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you end up at Swarthmore, and what's it like?
Yes. I was one of 8 black students who come into Swarthmore that year. So that was 62. Now, I was in the top 3. I mean, there were 3 of us who were in the top as we graduated. I had a small graduating class. And I applied to Bennington, where my sister had gone, Bryn Mawr, I think Antioch, and Swarthmore. And Bennington, actually, because my sister had not done that well at Bennington. And so Bennington says, well, we will admit you, but we're not going to give you the money that we understand Swarthmore is giving. And that we understand they really are going to be doing, however they said this in their letter.
So you're colluding.
You got it. And then I get the Swarthmore letter. And the Swarthmore letter says full freight for 4 years. Now, my mother obviously had no money. So I'm thinking, oh, okay, I guess I'll do Swarthmore. So I come in as one of 8. 4 boys, 4 black kids. This is all incoming freshman class. 4 black men, 4 black women. I assumed it was so that we would not have to date outside our little group. All of the 8 of us.
Did you immediately pair up?
Oh, yeah, immediately. Yeah, of course. But the main thing was that we were also all housed with Quaker children. The assumption being, I think, that the Quaker children would be more accepting of us, right? So I got Meg. I can't remember Meg's last name. Let me just say that was not automatically true once we started doing demonstrations. But when we come in, it's 8 and it's 4 and 4. And when I come in, there are maybe 2 other black students there. One was a senior and one was a sophomore, at least my memory, that's what I've got. Somebody, when I said this, we had an all-day meeting when we did our Hands on the Freedom Plow all day at Swarthmore. And I think the president or somebody may have said they thought there was a 3rd and that was an African student, but I'm not sure because I've never checked the records. So anyway, so we come in and I had been, as senior year always is, you've been sliding through, I come into Swarthmore and it's like, oh my God. And not only is it academically really pressurized, but it's also that most of these kids have come out of, Sidwell Friends, Quaker schools, come out of private schools, which now are called independent schools. I'm coming from a good public high school. But they've also come from families where they wintered in Paris, and I had been to Albany, that was New York, Albany, New York. And that was my one and only plane ride before this. And that was only because I was part of the All-State Youth Orchestra, which went to, or was that Buffalo? We went to Buffalo, Buffalo. So, these were worldly young kids, which was why I was so amazed when we did the demonstrations and they turned against us, but some of them, not all of them. So anyway, so I come in and, and I'm, as usual, very good in English, but it's like even poli-sci, which was an 8 a.m. on a Saturday course with a professor who was phoning it in. It's like, and I'm not a morning person. 8 a.m. on a Saturday, and it's like he's reading from his notes, please. But it was in that poli-sci class that I got to respect this one young guy who knew about Lenin and Trotsky and all this stuff that I had never heard of before, right? He's the one who says, I overhear him saying, once we do the demonstrations, they'd be better off, sticking to education. Oh yeah.
Your little theorist.
Yeah, my little theorist, who I just thought was so amazing because he knew all this stuff, right? Yes, because they'll be a better credit. They'll be able to do more for their race. Yes.
Credit to their race.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Were you aware of the sit-ins and the freedom rides before you go to college?
I was not, and that's so surprising to me. It's like I probably even knew maybe Emmett Till, but I don't remember it. because I'm sure for given my mother, although we had a weekly subscription to Jet magazine, but I don't remember seeing that then, unless I just blocked it out or she made sure I didn't see that issue. I don't know, because I do remember reading the Jet.
Well, Jet had plenty on the sit-ins and the freedom
It did,
rides, too.
but I don't remember any of that.
Huh.
So I don't remember any stuff, and then I get, so that's why I'm not really sure what draws me to the SDS meeting, but I don't know if you want to get to that yet.
So
Okay.
So you're in your first year at Swarthmore.
Yeah.
And you end up at an SDS meeting?
Yes. And the SDS chapter was called SPAC, the Swarthmore Political Action Committee. And the co-chairs of that were Mimi Feingold and Carl Whitman. Now, Mimi, I did not know until 2010 when I go back to Swarthmore for this all-day Hands on the Freedom Plow meeting, conference, event. And I go back and I decide I need to look up who Mimi was. And I found out that she had done 6 weeks in Parchment Prison on the Freedom Rides before she comes back to be co-chair of SPAC.
You didn't know that?
Didn't know that. When I'm looking at her, I knew nothing about her background.
Huh.
So she was a Corps person. She was on Corps staff. She later goes into Plaquemine County, deadly Plaquemine County, Louisiana. Didn't know any of that. But mainly, I did not know that she had done the 6 weeks in Parchment before I see her standing up at a SPAC meeting. Her co-chair, Carl Whitman, later, after he leaves Swarthmore, they get married. That didn't work out too well. He was gay. And then he becomes big in the gay rights movement. And he does this big treatise that people use, So it's like they were leaders then. And at this point, they were really doing a lot around, SPAC had 3 main things. One was organizing the all-black cafeteria staff for better working conditions, better pay, health conditions, all that stuff. And then I'll get back to that. Second was doing tutorials in Chester, Pennsylvania, which still has the Pitts School. I mean, just horrible, primarily black schools. So they were doing tutorials. And then the third thing was doing, helping Gloria Richardson and CNAC, the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee, a SNCC affiliate, with opening up the segregated public facilities. Cambridge black folks had the vote since the 40s, but now they were opening up, trying to desegregate the public facilities. So it was those 3 things. It was, the black cafeteria staff and the tutorial in Chester, Pennsylvania and Cambridge, Maryland. So all black cafeteria staff, I'm work study. So it's hard for particularly for young people to understand what something like Swarthmore was like. I mean, it was gorgeous, still gorgeous. So the dining hall was this gorgeous dining hall with these big old wooden tables, and we all sat around it and we were served. Nobody had to bust their own tables. You never thought of that, right? So the waitresses would come in and they would not only serve you, but they would take the stuff back, the plates back. Well, I was one of the waitresses in the evening, I think maybe 2 or 3 nights, because I was work study, as part of my 4-year full tuition paid. So one of the things that the black cafeteria staff had been trying to get was covering on this open, it was a big hot water pipe that was right on one of the walls. And so they would, in the rush to go back and forth in the dining hall, they would sometimes back into it, and they would get singed on their leg. Swarthmore never did anything about it, right? So that was one of the grievances they had. Okay, I'm moving back and forth. I hit it, and I swear to God, I had H2O backwards on my inner thigh. Oh yeah, for years.
Ouch.
Oh, it was amazing. Now, of course, the college is really worried about me. Right. So when it happens, I remember Mimi saying,
You're a student.
"You got it, I'm a student." And I don't have to worry about whether I sue them because I'm not working. You know, it's like, okay. So I remember Mimi saying to me, we've got to figure out, I mean, she was really concerned that I was okay. I mean, there was that. Yeah. But the other thing was, how can we use this to open up stuff for the rest of the really working, you know, cafeteria staff? So I remember being called into some...
Are you already going to the SDS
Yes.
by now?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, I should have mentioned that before because it's how I get there. But anyway, yes, and I'll go back to how I get there. So she says, this is what we're going for, da, 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 da. And there was this wonderful woman whose name I can't remember from the black cafeteria staff, who, and it's like I'm doing trays, who would come to our meetings, and she often brought some other black, usually female workers, because I think it might have been all female. I don't know who was in the kitchen, but in terms of the wait staff, I'm pretty sure it was all black female. Anyway, she was amazing, because I had in one of my old diaries, I had that she had, you know, she was coming and how amazing she was and stuff, and just, you know, and just smart as a whip, you know, it's just, anyway, so I remember being called into some administrative office, the dean's office, somebody who is clearly very nervous about the fact that I have gotten, you know, this thing. Yes, this injury. And they want to know what I want. And so I have been schooled by Mimi about, you know, well, this is what we need, and da-da-da. And if I remember correctly, we got some of it. But it was also because this wait staff really was strong. I mean, they were really amazing and stuff. And, you know, I'm sure Swarthmore was aware of its Quaker, you know, heritage, and the, you know, it looked bad.
So a little pressure.
Little pressure.
In the right way.
That's right, exactly.
They can move.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
And so, but the reason I first started going to the meetings is that it really is because, you know, I sometimes say it's because my mother's not there to stop me. I'm sampling everything. I'm a freshman. It's like, what can I get into? What's going on? You know, it's stuff. So I happen to, I don't know who told me about it, but somebody mentions it, or I see a leaflet. And I said, let me just try this, you know. And I get deeper and deeper into it. That's the thing. I have no idea what draws me. But for the first time, I see somebody actually protesting some of this stuff. You know, I mean, it's like, I think in the back of my mind, I always knew there were things going on. But it's not something my mother would raise. It's not something I was talking about when I was at Tarrytown. But, and maybe it was cumulative. You know, finally at this point, you know, at 62, 63, maybe I'm actually waking up to some of the racial stuff. I don't know. But I go to this thing, and they are so amazing to me. I mean, Mimi was just amazing. Carl, somewhat, but it was Mimi who I really, because she was just energetic, and, you know, it was amazing. So, you know, we do whatever we do with them. But anyway, so I go to this meeting, I find out what their agenda, you know, what programs they're working on. And then through them, I go to that first bus ride going down to Cambridge, Maryland. So I sign up for the bus ride.
Is this a weekend?
It's a weekend. That's right. Because the guarantee was that you would go down on a Saturday and you would come back Sunday night. And you would do picket lines. And the guarantee was that you would come back Sunday night, so you would be there for Monday classes.
And this is going to Cambridge?
Cambridge, Maryland, which I think was maybe about 2.5 hours away. Yeah.
And were Swarthmore students doing like Howard students and diverting student money into supporting the movement with buses and the like?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know, you know, because I really am new. So I don't really know what Mimi was doing. I just get on the bus. That's exactly it. I get on the bus. And we were one of many colleges from the area who were going down. So you would get there, and it wouldn't just be Swarthmore College students. It would be, because I remember Mark Suckle, who later goes down into the national office. He's coming from someplace. You would see Morgan State folk. And I don't remember the Howard people, but I remember some of the other nearby. Mm-hmm. Goucher, I remember, was coming down.
And so this is spring, fall?
No. Oh, I see. Okay, I get in. So it would be fall, probably late fall. 62, that's right, yeah.
And what was it like to go to Cambridge and participate in the picketing?
I have certain memories, and so that's really it. What I remember is the first one of the first demonstrations. I'm not sure if it was the first. And I remember we were trying to integrate the Chop Tank in. And I remember being enough close that I could see inside the inn. And it was an old bar and grill. You know, it was dirty, it was dank, it smelled, I always say rot gut liquor. I mean, it just nasty, you know. And, you know, I'm thinking, why am I trying to get in here? You know, it's like, this is a nasty place.
You do not want to be.
No, exactly. Under normal circumstances, yes, okay. But it was like, I see this big burly white guy who's telling me I can't come in because I'm black. And I see him, and it's like, you're telling me I can't, you know, it was stupid. So, you know, at a certain point, we start getting arrested.
You didn't have a confidence issue, did you?
No, right, right. Well, in many ways I did, but with this thing, no, it was clear. That was clear. Yeah. So I then, either there or we were also trying to integrate the skating rink, which, you know, and everybody ice skated at that, and it was a roller rink too.
Is that in Cambridge?
In Cambridge, right in Cambridge, and that was the source of it initially, because the reason Gloria Richardson, who is at that point the one of the overt leader, I mean, she's the one who most of the media knows, but as she often said, this was this was group leadership in Cambridge, and so there were a lot of people who were part of the main committee and stuff, but Gloria, it's her daughter and the young people in Cambridge who decide they want to integrate the roller, I used to know the name of it, but the rink, the skating rink. And so Gloria and one of her maybe relatives, it might have been her cousin-in-law as a matter of fact, but in any event, the two women go down to SNCC because they decide they need help in terms of how to organize demonstrations. And Gloria said, she put on little white gloves and they had heels and stuff. And of course they walk into the National Office and everybody's in jeans and overalls, stuff, but they had their little gloves. And so who gets sent as a SNCC field secretary is Reggie Robinson. And he's the one I first meet as a SNCC person when I go in. But the reason they choose the roller rink is because it's the young people. And Gloria said, it was her daughter who said, we're tired of this. But the older people knew, we don't know how to quite do this. We don't want the young people going crazy. And so we need to figure out how to organize this. But also Gloria was, her family was well known, both among the black people and the white people. And so, she and her family had the drugstore. They had various businesses. Pop Herb, whom I stayed with overnight when I would come down. Pop Herb was the funeral parlor.
So would a lot of people be there?
I remember a lot of people, but it went off and on. It wasn't always that. But in terms of Pop Herb, and as the funeral director, he would put up bail for us. There would be people who would stay in his attic, because I remember staying there. Mark, I remember, was there. There were other people, we would be housed up there. And yeah, so that, yeah.
Can you said Reggie Robinson was the first SNCC person you met?
Yeah.
And Gloria's the visible leader in Cambridge. Do you remember what your impressions were of them?
Yes, and before I forget, what I meant to say before I got into who was staying there, one of the things that was clear with Gloria, and we can get into this later, but while I'm thinking about it, was that she was never philosophically nonviolent. And in fact, she said, when her daughter said, when she's bringing people in and stuff, her daughter says specifically to Gloria, "Ma, you can't come on the picket line because you're going to hit somebody." Okay. And Gloria said she knew that was true. And it said, in fact, that one time she said she saw white guys whom she knew. She said, "I knew these guys. I grew up here. They grew up here. They're calling me names." She said, so when the picket line ended, when they started leaving, she said, "I tripped one of them." So that was Gloria. Yeah.
So it's not only that she wasn't philosophically nonviolent.
She wasn't even tactically nonviolent. No, except on the line. She understood that on the line I will be tactically. But her main thing was, when the demonstrations are gone, all bets are off. And she said, if they come on our side of Race Street, because Race Street was the dividing line between white and black in Cambridge, Maryland, she said, I can't guarantee one way or the other their safety. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cambridge, of course, became kind of notorious for some of the battles.
Yes.
But you weren't there for that.
I was not there for that. And I sometimes resent the way the history says it, which is, it's when Stokely goes in that suddenly, or Rapp goes in that suddenly everything goes. Those people were never philosophically nonviolent, and so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they were always protecting the black community when whites would come on rampages.
Yes.
Driving down the street and shooting.
That's correct. They were like Birmingham on Birmingham Hill. Same thing, which was the black community protected its community. If you come in here, and so Cambridge did the same thing. When the white vigilantes, the white domestic terrorists came through, then you would find that black people, and white people knew that black people did have their guns and they would shoot at them.
So you said that you're trying things out because you're away from home and do you remember how you felt participating in the sit-ins?
I felt amazing. I really did. I felt it was such energy to me to be part of, if I had done it by myself, it would be one thing. But it was like I was part of this group, these young people who were my age, and a lot of them were black. That was the thing when I get into SNCC. Well, anyway, a lot of them are doing something about the stuff that I have sublimated all of my life in Tarrytown. I knew black people couldn't move anywhere on Broadway or the other side of it. I knew that, but it was a given. I knew that I didn't see any black businesses. I didn't see this. I didn't see anything in terms of Tarrytown aside from my father and other people, going to the plant. There was no black middle class in Tarrytown, right? The one time we got somebody who actually had money was when Chris Calloway, Cab Calloway's daughter, came in, and she was in our senior class, or maybe our junior class, because she didn't last long. They eventually moved her to a private school, I think. But that was the first time I saw anybody who was middle class. So even seeing people who are running their own businesses, as I saw in Cambridge and other black communities in the South, I didn't see any of that in Tarrytown, So this was amazing. It was, first of all, I see black young people and white young people who are fighting this thing. We are so tight. The camaraderie is so amazing. I'm going to these mass meetings where people are singing these freedom songs, and it's like you lift up to another place, And I'm not religious, all right? My mother read the Bible every Sunday, but she hated organized religions. I never went to church except once, we can mention. Well, let me just divert. I started going to the Baptist church, the white Baptist church in Tarrytown. Mm-hmm. Didn't last long. I go one summer, and I think I came through maybe the camp. It might have started that way. My mother was very pleased because even though she could not handle organized religion, for whatever reason, she never mentioned it, she was pleased that I was going to church. So,
probably like Bible camp or something.
Yes, that's what it was. It was Bible camp. Because it must have been, because I remember I got $1 for memorizing the books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings.
Did you get
Okay.
extra money if you said it fast?
Yes. Well, that was the only way I could remember it. That's exactly. That's it. Yes. But I got this $1, and my mother was very pleased, and I did. Anyway, but then I overheard some of because it was all white. I think I was the only black child. Yes. And I hear some of the white people in the church. I don't know. I happen to just overhear this. And I hear them saying that, they say, we have to be careful because we don't want too many black kids coming in because then we'll get overrun. Okay. Mm. That was the last time I ever went to camp. I never went to church. My mother never said anything. That was it. So now I'm in Cambridge. It's this mass meeting. It's a black church. And it's like, oh, okay, because it's the songs. It's the songs. And what they're preaching about, of course, is freedom, and liberation. And it's all that stuff. So I get, so when I go back to Swarthmore each Monday, and then it becomes maybe each Sunday, Then sometimes it becomes Monday because we get held over. Then, well, when I go back, I'm taking all this back with me to campus, you know, and that energy I'm taking back with me.
So you get church without religion.
Yes, exactly. The best part. It's wonderful.
So you're getting increasingly involved then with the protests, the demonstrations related to campus and
Yeah.
Cambridge, and what makes you? I know you decide to take a year off school. How do you make that decision?
Right. Okay. Well, Penny Patch, who had been in her sophomore year, white student, she had gone down to Southwest Georgia. And I had heard about her, but she wasn't on when I first come in that first semester. Second semester, she returns from Albany, Georgia, and the SNCC project. And she hears that I have been, from the SPAC people, that I have been going to the meetings. And so she comes into my dorm room. And she said, look, I hear that, you know, you've been doing, you know, going to the meetings and the demonstrations, and, you know, you might want to think about taking off the next semester, which would have been the first semester of my sophomore year, and working full-time with SNCC in Cambridge, Maryland. And so, you know, I started thinking, she said, however, if you do decide to do this, you've got to apply, because I'm coming from the north. If I were Southern and black, you know, wouldn't have been a problem. But so she says, if you do decide to do this, though, you got to go by Ruby Doris. And that's what she meant. Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, the amazing administrator in the national office in Atlanta. So I didn't know anything about Ruby Doris then. So I say, okay, well, let me see what happens, you know. So I think I went ahead and applied, and then got confirmation that I have been accepted for this next, you know, for the...
And you're specifically applying to work in Cambridge?
Yes.
And so you're going to live with the Richardson family, not your kin, but...
Right, and actually probably not them, probably Pop Herb, because that's where I used to say, yeah. And so I get that I've been allowed to do this, and because I've gotten back from SNCC that there's confirmation. And so now the point is, how do I tell my mother that I'm thinking about doing this, right? So I go to the hall phone, because of course it's before cell phones, right? And I go to the hall phone, and I call my mother, and I tell her, you know, I frame it in the sense which I had done. I contacted the administration. I was guaranteed that I was going to I would maintain my full 4-year scholarship. Nothing would change. I could come back in again. They were kind. They were cool with it. So I tell her all this, and to me, she was amazingly calm. She asked some questions, but then I hang up and I go back to my dorm room, and I'm thinking, I'm over. I've made it through this. And I had been so worried about it, right? I don't make it more than I in my mind, I'm thinking 20 to 30 minutes. And I get called back to the hall phone. Somebody picked it up, calls me. I get to the phone, and it is my older sister, 9 years older than me, Karita, whom we call Keita. And she is screaming at me over the phone. Like, what are you thinking of? You can't do this. Da-da-da-da-da. And at that point, I think she was working for Columbia Records in the A&R division in New York City. And she said, you know, her main thing was, you can't sacrifice your education for this. Okay. But then somehow I convinced her. And I told her, I really have guaranteed that, you know, I'm coming back. It's going to be okay. Da-da-da-da. And somehow convince her. And so everybody's agreed. I can do this now. So I finish out, you know, the rest of that year. And then I had already accepted to do, to be a student, not intern, but a student worker at the nearby kind of halfway house. It was for foster kids. And so I was a counselor, student counselor there. That's how I made my money. I wanted to not do it, but then the person who had hired me had said, look, you know, it's too late for me to get somebody else now. So I made it through that. And then I took the bus, you know, in the fall, September, and no, it was October, because I remember I still had the stub bus trip. And I went down and went to Cambridge. But before I tell you that, I should say, because it reminds me of my mother driving me with my sister down to Swarthmore that first time. And she had never gone to Bennington, right? But I could see through her eyes that this was just amazing. I mean, this was, she had no sense of what Swarthmore meant, that it was an elite college. She had no sense of that, but she did have a sense that this was prestigious. The, rolling hills, and they let me drive. Now, had I known how I mean, if I had been them, I would never have allowed me to drive, okay? Because, at that point, I have always driven fast, but I was, 18, 19 years old at that point. And I remember driving through either the Holland or the Lincoln Tunnel. And at some point I changed lanes. And I remember my sister saying, no, you can't change lanes in the tunnel. It's like, and I'm still, okay, so we get down there, and my sister was absolutely wonderful because my sister could talk to anybody. I was very, I was shy in my own way. I mean, I didn't know how to deal with strangers. I worried about talking to people and stuff. My sister didn't worry about any of that. So she could talk to anybody, anywhere, whoever they were. So she talks to everybody in the dorm. She gets to me. She introduces me. This is my sister. She's May comes in. She's, my sister was the life of a party wherever she was. So I feel easier because she has kind of paved the way for me. And my mother, my poor mother, because see, my sister had left, and so it was really my mother and I growing up for those last years. And I was the baby, and it's like, we were like this, my mother and I. And so I don't know how she made it. For me, it was like, oh, I'm in this strange world. And, but she's gone back to an empty house. And I think about that now. It was just, it must have been hard. Yeah. So anyway, so she goes back with Keita and my sister Karita, and, and I'm there. And then I, get in. And during the school year, SPAC organizes not only this other stuff, but they decide to run a slate for the the May Queen. We did a May ceremony. That's right. It was the May Queen. And so it usually was, the girlfriend of the football players, or no, not football, because they had outlawed football at that point. All the frat boys. Okay. So it was somebody's girlfriend, it was a sorority sweetheart, it was somebody. But it would split the vote. Well, with us, we ran a slate, the SDS slate, and we all block voted, right? So Mimi, head of SDS, just got out of Parchment, becomes the May Queen. And I become one of the princesses, because that's what we were. And we had a little crown of little roses and stuff. My mother comes down for it. She is so proud. She does not know that a number of the frat boys and stuff are boycotting the ceremony. She doesn't know that some of the people in the newspaper have really, first of all, been absolutely death on our demonstrations and their editorial policy and some of the reporting, including from one of the people, Elsa, who was 16 when she comes on campus, was a friend of mine, had a total photographic memory. She was on my hall. See, let me just go back and say, the demonstrations really split the campus. And so...
and these aren't demonstrations on campus.
No.
These are the demonstrations that you're going to away from campus.
That is correct.
Okay.
So these are the demonstrations in Cambridge, Maryland. And these are the demonstrations where I hear this, person from my poli-sci class who says, these black students would be better off doing, he's part of a group of folks who normally liberal, I thought, and so that's really coming out in the newspaper, in comments, because they're, interviewing students who are saying, again, the Negro students would be better off, concentrating on their education. That's right. And so when it gets to the point where, and we're getting arrested, and all that stuff, but now it's getting to the May Queen, and we have taken over the ceremony, So a number of them don't come. Of course, all of the kind of progressive kids come and we do this. But the main thing is I'm thinking about my mother, and she's just proud as she can be that there's her daughter with her little, the roses and and I introduced her to everybody. And, she had remembered it from being down there, but it's like, my mother was not traveled, and so she had gotten on the train, come down to, by herself. Now, she was used to going into the city, into New York, but she knew the city. And this was new. And so, yeah, she was very proud.
So you gave her a nice memory before you quit school.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Yes, it did. And she didn't know that that's what I was going to do, so it was okay. That's right. So anyway, she goes back. We continue the rest of it. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Mimi and how important she is, Mimi Feingold, and that she had been on the Freedom Rides in that spring '61, summer '61, and then she's one of the leaders of it, the SDS chapter when you're there.
Yes.
She ends up in Louisiana with CORE.
Plaquemine Parish, that's right.
And so do you have a sense of sort of how she ends up in CORE and you end up in SNCC? Sort of you two going in different directions?
The thing is, see, when she came back from the Freedom Rides, she was already CORE. When she comes back from Plaquemine Parish, when she comes back from Parchman, she is already CORE. I think.
Because of the
Freedom Rides.
That connection?
I think it's the Freedom Rides. I don't know where she first hooks up with CORE, because she's from Brooklyn. I don't know whether she's doing stuff with Arnie, whatever, I can't remember his name. But the Brooklyn CORE chapter was major.
I kind of find it interesting that you're on the same campus and you end up in the field with different civil rights organizations.
It is, except that I'm coming through Cambridge and she's not necessarily. She's already an activist before we go into Cambridge.
But she's still going to Cambridge.
Absolutely.
Right? But that's not her introduction.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So and I didn't even know about CORE, but she was already that when I see her. Yeah.
And I wonder, you don't know when she goes into the field, do you? Does she go the same year?
No. No, I don't know whether, see, I'm pretty sure that she continues she was a senior. So I think she leaves Cambridge. When she graduates, I'm pretty sure that's when she goes into Plaquemine County in Louisiana.
I'm kind of trying to think about I've been interested personally just in how people get into different organizations.
Yes.
Sorry about the distraction.
No.
So you have a commitment to a summer job, so you go home and you do your summer job, and then it's October and you head into Cambridge?
Yes. And I continue doing the Cambridge work,
What is your work?
Truthfully, I have no real memory except demonstrations. Demonstrations, getting arrested, it wasn't voter registration, obviously, because they had the vote already. So I'm pretty sure most of that was demonstrations and organizing around that and getting adult community involved as much as the students, although they were pretty much already involved, adults, at that point. So I don't really remember because, see, I don't stay that long. Because then as a matter of fact, I hadn't thought about this. I go down in October. By November, I'm down in the Atlanta office. Because what happens is that Reggie Robinson says, look, I'm taking the train to either Cleveland or Cincinnati. I can't remember which. Cincinnati, okay. Because, what's his name from Arkansas? Bill Hansen. And white from Southwest Georgia. Oh God, not from Southwest. It'll come to me. They're getting married, right? And yeah, it'll come. Ruthie Harris.
No.
Ruthie. We'll leave it at that because I'll get totally off. So Bill Hansen and Ruthie are getting married in, you said, Cincinnati. And Bill Hansen was a white field secretary working in Arkansas, which is where Ruthie was from, right? And they're getting married. Reggie knew Bill. And so he says, I'm going to take the train from Cambridge, come with me. And on the way back, we'll go through the national office and then come back up again. Okay. So we take the train to Ohio. I meet Ruthie. Now, either his or her family was boycotting because it was interracial. So Ruthie was black, Bill was white. I just remember that Ruthie said she had nobody to be her maid of honor. Now, I had never seen either of these people before. They pour me into some little black dress. They put heels on me. And now I've been in jean skirts all this time. I've been in sneakers, right? So I have to fit into this little dress and then walk in these heels. And I'm the maid of honor for this person I've never met before. And then we go through the ceremony. And then on the way back, we get to the national office. So I get to this office, which in my mind, I'm thinking is going to be like Urban League, you know, with rugs on the floor and people dressed in little suits and stuff. And okay, well, maybe not the suits, because I mean, I had seen what the field workers looked at. But see, in my mind, I'm thinking also this is a national office, so they're probably dressed differently. Okay, so I get to the office was at 6 and 8.5 Raymond Street, I think. But anyway, 8.5 Raymond Street, which was a side street off Hunter. Not Hunter Road. God, what was the main drag? It's now Martin Luther King Drive.
You sure it's not Hunter?
Oh, maybe it is. It's Hunter. Yeah, it's Hunter, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard. Okay. So you went down. It was right near the Atlanta University Center, and you'd go off to the right if you were coming from downtown. And it was this small street. And it was right next to either a beauty parlor, I think it was a beauty parlor, and it was like a glass door. And I see Reggie get to the door, and there's this guy at the top of the stairs, and he's sweeping the stairs. He's in overalls. I hear Reggie, you know, hollering and whoop and holler, and either he or the guy says, "Hey, Captain, how you doing?" And they hug like long lost brothers, right? And I'm thinking, how egalitarian. Egalitarian is SNCC because this is the custodian, right? And then I find out it's Jim Foreman, the executive secretary of the organization, and he is sweeping, as he often did, because it really was a lesson for him. It was everybody in SNCC needed to see him sweeping so that they knew that every job was important. And yeah, you were supposed to keep it as clean as you could, the office. And secondly, that no job was too lowly for anybody in the organization to do. So he would periodically, you know, sweep the stairs. Not very well, let me just say. But he would do it. Okay. So then I come up. Reggie says to him, I'm coming from Swarthmore. We're on our way back to Cambridge. Foreman finds out that I can take shorthand, which is like, I try and tell people it's kind of like texting but with symbols. So everything had a symbol that we did. And I knew I had learned this and could type 90 words a minute. Both of those because Tarrytown Public Schools, when I'm at Washington Irving Junior High School in 7th grade, because I'm black, and it really was that, because I was at the top of my class, they shift me into secretarial, assuming that I'm going to do the secretarial route. Okay. Now, at that point, my sister, is at Bennington, but that's okay. And also I'm under the hill, you know, it's all that stuff. So my mother makes sure that it's only that year. I do remember her being very upset when she heard that I was being shifted into this. So I either took the whole semester in the 7th grade or the whole year. Either way, I now can type 90 words a minute and I can take Reg shorthand. So
I wonder if somebody should make a keyboard with shorthand.
They should, and they're older. Well, let me not get okay. So, and I'll get to Joanne Grant and my shorthand notes when I'm taking it in SNCC. But so Foreman finds this out and then decides I'm going to be his secretary. So Reggie goes back to Cambridge alone.
So much for Cambridge.
So much for Cambridge. I leave my clothes there. I don't remember what happens with the clothes. They probably stay in Pop Herb's, I don't know what happens. And then I go into the Freedom House, which is where the female staff, some of the female staff from the national office lived. But my first image of
fall 63.
That's correct. And the reason I remember it was November was because the first staff meeting I remember was, and we had called in, it wasn't just the Atlanta National Movement staff, it was also the field staff. And Kennedy had just been shot. And so there's this whole discussion about how we're going to respond to it particularly given that the federal government hasn't done diddly squat for us and stuff. And I remember Foreman saying, we have to be very careful about this. I remember Dinky crying. Dinky, who was Foreman's becomes later on Foreman's second wife. But I remember her being the only one who was crying, actually. I'm sure there were others, but most of the people were really trying to figure out how do we respond to this strategically. So yeah, that's how I remember I was there by November.
I remember something about that wedding. Buffington?
Puffington.
Buffington? Is that Ruthie's name?
Ruthie might be. I don't remember.
I don't know. It seems like I remember you telling me something about that wedding, like was something illegal or was something, do you remember anything?
No.
Okay.
I might have once remembered it, but I don't know.
I don't remember either.
Okay.
So.
Because I don't think there was any miscegenation law there. So, yeah.
What was your job with Foreman as Foreman's secretary? What is
Yes.
that?
Well, I'll tell you, before I get to that, let me tell you when you came into the Atlanta office, okay? When you first came in, you came up the stairs with the plate, with the window behind you. Come up the stairs. You came into the kind of reception area. And that would have been, you would have seen, oh gosh, I remembered his name before.
Jimmy Bolton?
Jimmy Bolton, thank you, yes. Jimmy Bolton was there, and he was one of the few guys. Now, Jimmy was the only person who was overtly gay. I'm sure there were other people, male and female, but he was the only one who didn't really try and hide it, And then there were other people at the two desks. And Jimmy, by the way, eventually goes off with his mate to Australia. But at that point, it's Jimmy, and it's maybe Nancy Stern, other people, because we took turns being at the reception area. If you looked to the left, you would see Julian Bond, and he was communications director. When I get there, Mary King is his assistant. We didn't have titles, but Julian was the communications director. So when I get there, Dottie Zellner had already left, who had been the previous person assisting Julian in communications. So it's Julian, and it's Mary King, it's Bobby Yancey, who becomes the second in command at the Schomburg later on. And stays there for 25 years, but is at that point, she's head of, I think, relationships with what now is known as the HBCUs, the black campuses. There was Billy Stafford, Campus Travelers, that's right. And so she's head of that, the Campus Travelers, thank you. And then there is Billy Stafford, who is doing some other work with black campuses, and Billy later goes to, is wonderful social urban planner at City College in New York, but at that point is doing work something around black colleges, but I can't remember exactly what. And then there is Jack Minnis, who was the main person, he was the head of our research department. And we had this he was incredible. He is this crusty old white guy who, drank too much, smoked too much. You would go in his office, it was like a fog, it was like China, And yet, he could pull research from a stone. So can I mention the thing? Okay, there was something he did which became this is the Mississippi chronology. And it's a chronology of, it's called the Mississippi Chronology of Violence and Intimidation in Mississippi since 1961. And what Jack did was he compiled all of these pages with photos and what was called Watts line. So that was the wide area telephone service. That was like the 800 number that people could call into at any hour, either to our national office or to one of us in the national office, if a church were being bombed or somebody had been arrested, some violence to voter registration workers. They would call in. And the Watts line meant that it was somebody, and this is when you still had operators. So somebody, say it's Emma Bell. And Emma Bell calls and says, Hollis Watkins has just been arrested. But she can't say that. She calls and calls person to person for Hollis Watkins. Okay. And so Hollis Watkins, we know, oh, so that's Hollis Watkins. He's in the second congressional district. We know the number. We know it's about how, no, I'm sorry. She would say, I'm calling for Emma Bell. Okay. She would call for herself. And then she'd say, I'm calling person to Emma Bell. We would say, Miss Bell is not here right now. Is there a number where we can reach her? And then we would know to call her back. What happened is that at a certain point, the all-white operators, telephone operators in Mississippi, realized what we were doing. They would then cut off when the persons tried to give the number. But until that, we at least always had the name. Okay. So then we would hang up, and then on this 800 line, the Watts line, we would call back for free. And find out that Hollis Watkins was in jail, or somebody had been, a church had been burned, or whatever. Those Watts line reports are the reports that are compiled for that Mississippi chronology. And I'll...
Go ahead.
Okay. The reason that was so important, having a chronology, was that it showed the pattern of white supremacy. So nobody could say, well, it was just Governor Thompson. He's particularly racist. Or it was this sheriff in Greenwood, or it's the system of racism. And you show that through the pattern of all of these churches, all these people being beaten for voter registration, the systemic nature of the white supremacy. And then what they've done to basically, supposedly federally protected rights, just run roughshod over them, right? I will say I used that. I used it not only to give a chronology when we're doing the films, but more particularly when I leave Boston the first time, and it's LA, and there's yet another case of police brutality in LA. And I'm working for a film company, Rainbow TV Works. This was 80 to 81, 82. I know from Jack Minnis's chronology. So I say to the people who are working on this, we need a chronology so that we can, so that we can show the pattern of it. And to them, it's like, oh, what a good idea, I would not have known it had it not been for Minnis. Okay. When I'm working as the Director of Information of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, and there's a spate of police brutality. It's Howard Beach racially motivated violence. It's, Eleanor Bumper is 69 years old, gets off by Officer Sullivan with a shotgun on an eviction notice. It's Michael Stewart, 24 years old, gets beaten to death for doing graffiti in a New York City subway. It's all of that. But what I say to the committee that we're working with is, we need a chronology. Minnis, right? We need a chronology to show it's not just the cop hasn't had enough, sensitivity training. It's because he's in the midst of a systemic racist police department, right? It's like what they're doing. Anyway, so.
Is that what the Guardian is doing now?
You got it.
Trying to log all of the police murders in the U.S.?
That's right, because the NRA won't let us keep any stats in this country, right? So the UK is keeping the best stats. Hello. Which is why I'm glad, by the way, that in Chicago, I'm going far afield, but I'm going to say this. Why in Chicago, they have gone back to that brutal man who tortured black citizens in the 80s and then, got finally put up for charges. And I think may have spent some time, I'm not sure, but he is legend. And people kept talking about him because he was brutal. He tortured people. Got, guilty pleas from them when they weren't guilty. We did in Eyes on the Prize the Hampton and Clark, Fred Hampton, Mark Clark assassinations in the second series of Eyes on the Prize, which people are now hearkening back to because that's another case where, the cops said, oh, we had to protect ourselves, and they found out that all of the bullets were going inside the Black Panther Chicago office, all of them, because the cops were stupid enough to leave the office open. So people, the community's walking through, the media's walking through, right? Anyway, the main thing.
And this is from Eyes on the Prize, second series, the episode A Nation of Law.
That's correct.
The police murder of Fred Hampton and
Mark Clark
in Chicago.
That's correct.
All right, you were going to say, and this is important because.
And so this is important because one of the things you get is the pattern of it. People always wonder, well, why are they going off? It's like in Detroit. Why would they go? Why would the black community go, totally berserk because some cops are closing what's called a blind pig there, an after-hours joint? That makes absolutely no sense. Well, if you go back and you find out there was the big four, 2 white and 2 black cops, which would stop all of these people, even if they were just singing doo-wop, this is Detroit, right? Doo-wop. We had to explain all of that in Eyes on the Prize because otherwise it makes no sense. It's the pattern, the systemic pattern of police brutality that always exists in any of these cities. And it's always, always the jumping off point. Always. It's something, Steve Ferrer, who was the white writer, and just a great guy. I mean, we clashed sometimes, but he was really serious about his stuff and a great writer. So I remember at one point we're doing Malcolm X Make It Plain, right, for American Experience, PBS. And I say, the point is that, when you're doing Malcolm, what happens in LA, what happens in New York with the Muslim guy from, the Fruit of Islam guy from Number 7 Mosque, that's part of a pattern. And he said, and he actually said, because he was interested, he said, what are you talking about? I said, the police are an occupying force in these communities. And I said, now I know you can't say that in narration. He said, why not? And it's a line in narration, right?
And you say we, that's Black Side.
Black Side, and yeah, Black Side. And also I wasn't sure with whether Orlando, would be okay with that because it's enough that we're doing, just to say, enough that we're doing Malcolm X Make It Plain.
Sorry, I meant when you said we were doing the film, I meant it was Black Side that was doing the film.
Right, no, I thought you were going to say something else in the middle. No, and yes, it is Black Side, but it's Henry was not that much involved in Malcolm X Make It Plain. So it really is, Orlando is the producer-director, I'm the co-producer, and Steve is the series writer along with Orlando. So it really is, what Orlando and Steve feel, we can get through, American Experience at that point. So I was very happy, that people could see, yeah, it's an occupying force. And actually, I think I said occupying army. It's like an occupying army, yeah. But that has to do with, back to this, chronology and the fact that it's systemic and that you have to show that. And so, in fact, when we're doing the police brutality, I did a chronology, right? And I'm saying to the groups that are there, we need to do a chronology so people see it's not just Eleanor Bumpers, it's not just Michael Stewart, it's not just... And so they give me early stuff, because this is now the mid-80s. So they go back to the 70s, the 60s. I draw up a chronology. I remember sending a packet out to a journalist, a reporter, black journalist, who was with New York Newsday, because they were based in Long Island, but they then had a New York edition, and they were really good. It was a great paper. And the reporter calling me and saying, I'm getting this packet, and it was not only the press release, but this chronology. And he said, are you a reporter? And I said, no. And what I said was, I was trained by the movement. I didn't say SNCC because I figured he wouldn't know what SNCC was, but I said I was trained by the movement. And so I said, and one of the reasons I did the chronology was because I didn't say because Jack Minnis told me how to do this, but it's always good. And I was meeting with some young people, BSO, Organization of Black, oh my goodness, no, OBS, not Organization of Black Survival, Organization of Black something, it's OBS. And it's a group that's been going on for the last 20 some years. And they were involved also in the Ferguson responses, but they do grassroots community organizing. Struggle, Organization for Black Struggle. So I had been showing our Orangeburg Massacre film at Washington University. This is right after Ferguson, so it was this year. And I'm showing the film, and one of the professors, a young black professor, who was there and postdoc, and he came up, he introed me, and then he said, would you be interested in speaking with some of the young people who are part of this organization of, what did I just say? Black Struggle. And I said, oh yeah, so the next day, he brings some of them by WashU, and we sit in the cafeteria, and we're talking, and it's clear. I said, look, I know that the stuff what we did in SNCC is not really, some of it will be useful, but it's a different time. And I know that it's not just the technical stuff. You're dealing with a community that has seen all the stuff that was supposed to change stuff, and it hasn't. And the other thing they told me was, they said, well, the other thing is, and actually the young professor said, wasn't a professor, but anyway, the young faculty person said, and the other thing was that the movement kind of bypassed St. Louis. So the kind of folks you talk about with, Amzie Moore and Fannie Lou Hamer, he said, that didn't really happen here. And one of the people from OBS says to me, look, every King Day, they have the usual Dr. King ceremony, and the black glitterati come past, and she said, as a matter of fact, she said, and they get out of their limos, and she said, I call them the fur-coated ones. And she said, they come out with their fur coats, they go into whatever big black church, and then they come back and they go back to the suburbs or wherever. And she said, and so we don't have that grounding that maybe you guys did at that time. Now, I'm sure that there are grassroots leaders they have there, but and they've been working with them. But, it made me realize not everybody had the kind of stuff that we had, nor the kind of cohesive communities that we had, because for whatever, I may be not churched, but I know the role that the black church played in the southern communities where we organized. And, and you could go up on somebody's porch and sit for a while and have some sweet tea and talk before, so they could get to know you. You can't do that at Cabrini Green when it was still existed, in Chicago. So all of that stuff I know is different. But I show them Jack. I show them the chronology, right? And I said, toward the end,
The kids in St. Louis?
This kids in St. Louis, young people in St. Louis, and one older, because she was like 40s, so she said, I'm the older person here. I show them this. They were it was like, we could use that. Because I said, you can, once the people see, it's not just this, and it's not just that, and it's not just Freddie Gray, and it's not history of it, And it's like when they're finally now saying that like 99%, I'm making this up, but certainly over 95% of the cops that have been put up on charges never go to trial, because, it never goes anywhere. So to know that kind of stat from the 60s and the 70s, how many cops get put up, how many judgments are found. And when somebody said $15 million has been put out to victims, all that stuff, those stats are important. Yeah, you can have the protests, and that's important too, but those stats are, you can't deny that kind of stuff. That's Jack. I learned that in SNCC, So he's doing the research department. Back to the National. We have a printing press, and so oh my goodness, I can't remember the guy. Wilson Brown. He was one of them, and then there was another one who married, and they went to Antioch. Oh my goodness, who also ran it? But I'll do Wilson until I can remember. Anyway, we had our whole printing press in the basement. Right, so that we didn't have to depend on anybody saying they wouldn't print a certain leaflet. Had our own printing press. And then we had, so through communications, we're also sending out the student voice because we knew that the mainstream media wasn't going to print the stuff that we wanted. So we would send that out to the SNCC offices. And so I forgot, we also had a Friends of SNCC, which was like Philadelphia, Mimi Shaw's mother, Mrs. Shaw's head of is part of Friends of SNCC in Chicago, or they're all over the country. And so if somebody got arrested, for example, then we'd get that Watts line report, then we would call the Justice Department in the national office, and then we would call a Friends of SNCC person. So, for example, you would call Mrs. Shaw in Chicago, and she would then call the sheriff's office if we had it, his home at night if we had his number, or the office, and then that person would say, Mrs. Shaw would say, look, we know you got, Curtis or Hollis or, Mrs. Fannie Lou, Mrs. Hamer, and they'd better come out of the jail the way they went in. So for the first time, the white supremacists in Mississippi know somebody outside Mississippi is actually looking at this, even before the summer of '64. We're connecting people to this. So we have somebody coordinating Friends of SNCC, and that was Dinky, Constantia Romilly. And then she was also doing Campus Friends of SNCC until Betty Garman comes in and she does the Campus Friends of SNCC. And that was all the campus chapters, UC Berkeley, NYU, University of Chicago, all these campus things. So we can call them. So they're being used as points where we're getting information about the struggles that we're doing. We're getting photos out. We're getting the student voice out. Press releases are going out. They're trying to get it published in their school newspapers, information about it. If they have any contacts with the local media, they're trying to get that in. So it's this network. I mean, out of the national office are these networks of people all over the country whom we're using for fundraising, for communications, and for fundraising, communications, and whatever else.
What's your contact like with people in the field in Mississippi and Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama?
Yeah, they're calling in. So when, for example, Emilye calls in, she calls into us. But also we had, Margaret Block, for example, she said to me, you remember I had to call into you? She said, every day, and during the summer of '64, they're calling in to the Jackson office, but before that, they're calling into the national office. And I think we might have done it once a day until '64, when it's twice a day and going into the Jackson office. But once a day into the national office to say, this is what happened, to make sure we know they're still there. And the main thing is, it's before cell phones. So if somebody didn't have a dime for the coin box on the phone, you wanted to make sure they could get to you. So it's called. They're calling in. They're telling us, maybe something incident that's happened. But the other thing was, Ruby Doris was serious about, you will get me your monthly field reports. Mm-hmm. And unless you send those to me, you will not get your little $10 a week, which was, of course, $9.64 after taxes. So she was, Ruby, and the thing is, people really respected Ruby, because I remember Ivanhoe saying, he said, yeah, people respected Foreman for what he brought, which was that administrative sense, knowing about history, collect everything, knowing how to construct an office, and also just that long-range thinking. But Ruby, he said, we knew she really, really cared about us. And Ivanhoe once said to me, he said, when I was in jail, and that was probably in Parchman, he said, and I guess was Ivanhoe in Parchman? I'm trying to remember. Or was it a local jail?
When he went in with the truck of stuff?
Yeah.
That was in Cleveland, Mississippi.
Cleveland, Mississippi, because it was Amity. That's right.
No. He was with Clarksdale. It was Aaron Henry.
Yes, with the drugs in the pharmacies. That's right. Was that the only time he was in? Maybe
Probably
it was.
Not.
Okay. One of the times he was in, he said he was in for however long, and that he would get letters, Ivanhoe said, every day. And I said, how did you get them every day? He said, I don't know, but I was getting, he said, letters from Ruby Doris every day. Asking how I was doing, just making sure that I knew somebody was taking care of me, was thinking about me and stuff. And so Ruby would do that stuff. And also because, she had such an amazing history. Jim Foreman, had been just brutalized in LA, and, he had been in Monroe, and he'd been this and that. But Ruby had been in Parchman, and Ruby had been in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and those 30 days jail, no bail. And also just Ruby, was just, Ruby had a presence, when Penny Patch says to me at Swarthmore, you got to go by Ruby Doris to get your application accepted, I didn't really know what she meant, but I know that a lot of people were scared to death of Ruby Doris. I was. It was just, she was nice, but she was kind of like Miss Baker. She did not suffer fools gladly.
Was she still a Spelman student when you met her?
No, she was totally off staff. She was full-time in the office at that point. She had not yet married Cliff and had not yet had the baby. But, and that was funny too. I remember we had a shower for Ruby when she was pregnant. And the thing is, and it was all female, right? And normally, women know what to do at showers. You have little chit-chat and the baby and so and so. We were SNCC women. All our discussions always had to do with politics and what was going on in the field and who was doing what. And so I remember whole periods of silence. Mm-hmm. It was like, okay, so how do we talk about this? It's like the kind of informal, it wasn't like we weren't friends. It wasn't like we didn't party. We knew how to party. But to have small talk. We didn't do small talk too swell. So, and we didn't do baby stuff. It's like, Julian was a family member, but, he had his kids and Alice was off somewhere. She wasn't part of the staff. I'm trying to think, Minnis was married, I'm sure, but there were no babies. So.
Is it different when the men are married and have their families and then the women?
Right, but also, I don't remember ever seeing Ruby's baby. I'm sure she brought it in at some point, but Cliff took care of the baby, and she was away, but when she was away, when she came into that office, she was in the office. So the shower was not, she hadn't had the baby yet, and it was like, and none of the women that I remember had any babies. Nobody had any babies. It's like, how could you have babies when you were on call 24/7? It's like, anyway. So I just remember the silences at the shower, yeah. So anyway, Ruby, yeah, was, she was just like a major force in that office. And she sang, "I Need Your Reports," which is why I remember you saying how interesting it was that you got, that there was so much documentation with SNCC. And that's because, you had Ruby Doris saying, you've got to write it down and you're not going to get, oftentimes we didn't get the little $9.64, but at least you could expect it. Because I remember when I was in Cordele, Georgia, I didn't get it one week, and I had to go to the NAA guy who really didn't like my being in town, Cordele in Southwest Georgia. And he ran the restaurant. And I had to say to him, could you just, I don't have enough money for a hamburger, but could you just take this, whatever little bit I had? And he said, I remember saying something about, I'll expect the rest when you get paid. He was not pleasant. But I also remember putting a dime in, I spent 30 cents on his jukebox to play Walk On By, Dionne Warwick. But anyway, so.
There's like a theme here.
Yes, there is. That's right. That's right.
What is your day-to-day work like in the office? What's your job with Foreman?
Okay. So what's interesting to me is that Foreman had a way of giving you as much responsibility as he thought you could take and more than you thought you could take. There were times that he let me do things and I thought afterward, it's amazing that he let me do this. But what happens is when I come in, I get this bird's eye view of the whole SNCC organization, the Friends of SNCC, the Campus Friends of SNCC, the field offices, the daily, who's in the field offices, who's responsible, who's not responsible. I'm taking minutes from the exec committee meetings so I know who's in trouble. I get a real sense of the field and all of the operation. And so I remember.
Have we said what Foreman's job is?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I may not.
You did. Well, anyway, we
Okay.
said it when you met him with Reggie.
And he was the executive secretary. That's right. So Jim Foreman, yeah, he's the executive secretary. And he's in an office. I'm right outside his office along with this teeny tiny little area. And Dinky Romilly is the Friends of SNCC and Campus Friends of SNCC, and we're back to back, and I'm at this little desk, and Foreman's office is over here, and I think Chessalonia Johnson, who is the bookkeeper, poor Chessie. That was a thankless job. It is thankless anyway with a nonprofit, but it's the field staff saying, I don't have to give you anything, I'm putting my life on the line. Okay, so it's all of that coming out. So I'm sitting there, and I have, I remember letters to Mike Standard, who was one of the lawyers in our one of the many pro bono firms, Rabinowitz and Boudin. And we had this chatty relationship, and part of it is, all these people are making me feel that I really belong to this thing. That this is like this family of people. And so when I call Mike Standard, it's like Attorney Standard is, hey, Mike, how you doing? Da-da-da-da. And I had these things, I sent something to him or somebody where I said, and we could not do what we do. And it was in fun. And I knew they would get it. We here in the South fighting for our freedom and our civil rights could not do what we do without your doing what you did. And it was the kind of thing that you sent to a contributor, you know.
Right.
And Freedom Now, you know, and then I would sign Foreman's name, and then you would always know I was the one because it was the typical steno thing. So you would put Jim Foreman, JF, all uppercase, initial caps, and then colon, and then lowercase JR. So I was the person who was typing it, but oftentimes I'm the one writing it too, you know, so, which was amazing. I mean, he's given me this responsibility to write these letters. So I'm writing, you know, letters to the so-and-so or to the so-and-so or, you know, and then sometimes I'm transcribing as well. So I remember transcribing a speech by, Prathia Hall, thank you. Prathia Hall, who could, I mean, she could just lift you up, you know. So it's on a reel-to-reel recorder, right? And I'm typing on this IBM Selectric 2, which I love, cause anyway. And she's doing, it probably was not Southwest Georgia. It was probably Selma, but I'm not sure now. And I swear to God, I'm typing on this typewriter and tears are just streaming down. You know, it's like she so captured me. She just lifted up, you know, she brought you to the place where you would go through hell to get your freedom. You know, you would follow her anywhere, you know. Somebody said about Prathia that, you know, even Dr. King once said, when both of them were at a mass meeting, that he did not want to follow, he did not like following Prathia. Yes. High praise, very high praise. And Prathia, you know, Prathia's parents were Pentecostal or evangelical, whatever, ministers in a small black church in Philadelphia. So she came out of that. And then when she passed, she had just taken the Martin Luther King chair at Boston University. And, you know, she was very religious, you know, but she never let religion get in the way. So she, in Selma, really, you know, well, she never cursed, but, you know, really points her finger at some of the SCLC people who say to the folks after Bloody Sunday, and she talks about that in her Hands on the Freedom Plow section. She says, you know, I told the SCLC, Dr. King's organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they had, some of the field staff had said to the local people, you can't come on the demonstration unless you're philosophically nonviolent, not just tactically, but philosophically nonviolent. And in fact, you are not really in the movement unless you can do this. And she said, I had to really get on their case because she said that was like blackmail. And she said, and it wasn't true. And you don't do that to people. You don't use the movement in that way. Now, she was philosophically nonviolent, but she understood that, you know, you separate that stuff, you know. But no, I remember, so I'm sitting there in the national office just typing this up and tears pouring down. And I would also transcribe, I would take the minutes for like executive committee meetings. We would bring the field staff in from Mississippi, Southwest Georgia, Alabama, you know, Arkansas. I want to say it was quarterly, but I'm not sure. So they would come in quarterly, and we would always meet. Normally, we couldn't meet, I don't think, at our offices because they were too small. The workroom, because, that's what I neglected to say, there was a workroom. And so there's all this other stuff going on, and then you would go into the workroom. I'm going to just divert for a second. You would go into the workroom, and there would be where you would put together press releases and staple them, and you know, because at that point, the mimeograph machine didn't have a collator, so it wouldn't automatically collate and staple. Later we get that, but right then, it's pumping off the mimeograph machine and the stencil, and we're taking, and Wilson Brown is taking it up, and you know, so we have, it's a group of people, and they're in the workroom, and you have all the stuff on the table, on the work table, and somebody would take it off and hand it to the second person, somebody stapling, somebody collating, stapling, folding it, putting it in the stuff, stamping it, and so there's a relay, it's a, you know, thing.
Assembly line.
Assembly line, that's the word I'm looking for. So it's an assembly line. So now we also had water bugs. So, and they were the flying water bugs that you get in the South. So I say that to say, oh, and also, by the way, if you were on the assembly line, you're always singing freedom songs because the work really does go quicker if you sing something. And so, you know, everybody's singing and we're working and we're doing the stuff. Okay, now, on exec committee meetings, I would, but the workroom was not large enough usually to hold the staff. So we would then, we could get sometimes Pascal's, although Pascal's really was a black businessman. And so he would charge us. So we would go to Frazier's, who really, he was so lovely. Frazier's basement, we would go down and have our meetings there sometimes. And he would feed you if you didn't have money, unlike Pascal.
Is that why Pascal's in the Atlanta airport now and Frazier's not?
Well, that could be. That's true. You know, one made money and one, yeah. But Frazier's was wonderful. They were just lovely. And, you know, you would go to Pascal's for the, they had the bird cage. And so they would have, you know, what's his name in the Pips, you know, and they would have all the R&B people come in. And sometimes you would get to meet them and they would be so excited to meet the SNCC kids and all that kind of stuff. But it was the bird cage. That was at Pascal's. But anyway, so I would be taking notes in shorthand. Well, the first exec committee meeting I take, it's 33 pages. And it's 33 pages because I'm in awe of all these SNCC people, right? They are...
This is 33 pages typed or
Typed.
33 pages shorthand?
No, 33 pages typed.
So after you took it in shorthand, then you would type it out.
That's right, that's right. I would take it in shorthand and then I would transcribe my notes. I would type it onto these long green stencils, and which was a problem because, of course, the stencils you couldn't correct except with this little green fluid. So you had to take the film up, the screen up, and then put the little green on, and then wait for it to dry, put the film down, and then hope that you hadn't put too much of this green stuff on, because if you did, then when you typed over it, it would smudge it, and you'd get these smudgy letters all over the place. So I was fairly accurate. That was the other thing. I could actually type 90 words a minute with pretty good accuracy. Anyway, so I had 33 pages of notes, of minutes, pages of minutes typed out, and then I had to run them out. Now, the problem was I was there late at night, so I would sometimes be there during this period that I'm getting these minutes out. And again, I'm really in awe because these people know more than I have ever heard of. Not only do I never talk in staff meetings, but I'm also just in awe of all these people who are talking about organizing in ways that I never thought about. They've been through stuff I've never thought about. You got, you know, the NAG people who are talking about, you know, Nietzsche, you know, I mean, it's like we're going through that. And also, you know, Bayard Rustin and the so-and-so, but who have organizing techniques. And then you've got the Southern young people who know Black history in a way that I don't know. So it's all of this. All of this is combining to say, you shut up and take the minutes, right? So I'm taking the minutes. Okay, get all these things. But it takes about a week, and I have it in my diary, still taking the minutes. I mean, still typing the minutes, still typing the minutes. Now, the meeting has since disbanded, right? And I think this was the one that we did at IPS, Interdenominational Theological Seminary, ITS, which was part of what becomes the Atlanta University system. Interdenominational Theological Seminary, okay. And so, okay, typing it up, I'm about to run it off, and I'm by myself. So I have to go by myself into the workroom. Now, the workroom really does have these flying water bugs. They're big.
Is that a cockroach?
It's like cockroaches, but I thought they were water bugs. Maybe they were cockroach. They were flying cockroaches.
I mean, I don't know if they might be the same thing.
Okay, but they flew. That was the main thing that was operative.
Cockroaches fly.
Yes, that's true. But that's the main thing for me was that they flew. What they were, it was that they flew. And so you would come in and they'd be all on the floor. They'd be on the wall. And so you would have to steel yourself for, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to run this off. I'm not going to pay any attention to these things. And I'm just going to run this thing off.
Ready to duck.
Yes, and if you had to, that's it. And you tried not to crunch anything. You see, that's the other thing. Okay, so doing that, and then I finally got it, and then I had to mail it, to the various field offices. And that was the other thing. And as a matter of fact, the day that I mailed it off, I have in my diary, the sun is coming up. I have just finished doing the minutes. And I say the birds are singing, it's a wonderful day. And so I get that off to whoever was going to disseminate it in the field, and stuff. And so I would do that. And then I would often take the minutes. And other people would too, but because I knew shorthand, you see, and type so quickly, it was like, well, Judy can do this because she, does this stuff. And then I would correct things, because I've always been editing things. And, I wouldn't edit the thoughts. And I don't even think I would actually, back then, I wouldn't even edit anything else. It would just be whatever I heard. That's true. Yeah. So I wouldn't try and, for example, finish a sentence or do whatever. It was whatever they said, got into it. Okay. So I would do that. What else? And support anything else that was going on. Yeah.
So talking about the minutes, at a certain point, you and some of the other women have a little protest.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I understand it.
No, I'll tell you. That's right. So what happens is Foreman, see, I had been saying to Foreman, I want to go to the field. I want to go to the field. Okay, which meant I want to go into Mississippi. And in my mind, it was Mississippi because that's where all the action was. I knew about Alabama. I knew about Southwest Georgia. But most of what I was getting information about, was because it was Bob and it was that whole Mississippi thing. It was Bob Moses. And that's where it was. Okay, so I keep saying, I want to go to the field. And he was saying, no, wasn't going to happen. I mean, he did not want to lose a good secretary, right? So at one point, I end up, I know, he goes someplace. And Dinky got me a ticket for the first Freedom Day in Hattiesburg. That's right. So January, Hattiesburg, 64, Hattiesburg. I'm down there. And I come back, Foreman was living. But then at some point in here, I get tired of taking the minutes. There were other women who got tired of the minutes, but also they kind of, I think, wanted to be in the field too. But also it was like, we get the secretarial stuff. Now, aside from Jimmy Bolton, the guys, see, the thing is, the national office was where you put white people, because white people really risked the lives of the local communities and local and other SNCC, black SNCC staff people if they were working in Mississippi. Sherrod wanted an integrated staff in Southwest Georgia, right? Because he wanted to model what this thing could be. And philosophically, he absolutely believed that. And he believed that it was based on his theological understanding of what was supposed to. So beloved community meant you did it in your project as well. Other folks were not playing that. And because it really did risk lives. So what it meant, though, was that for white people who want to be involved, oftentimes, particularly white women who could get black guys killed in the field, they were then in the office. So Mary King's in the office, Casey's in Jackson, but she's in Jackson. Casey Hayden is in Jackson. But mainly, you didn't really have any white women in the field, except for Southwest Georgia. And so Dinky's there, Nancy Stern is there, white women in the national office.
Mary King.
Mary King, I thought I mentioned her. Yes, Mary King, yeah, that's right. And even for Mark Suckle, I mean, he's not there. He's doing some print stuff too later on. When Tommy Owakiyama comes, and that's the other part that's part of the national office, there's a print photo department. And so Danny Line is there, and then Tommy Owakiyama, who was Tom then, but as part of the nationalist thing where people are really going back to their heritage, right? Tomio, then Tom, is Japanese Canadian, right? And so he goes to Tomio. And so that's what he's known now as as a really premier photographer and has had exhibits and wonderful photo book and stuff. Okay, he comes in through, he's doing a book that he says, similar to Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. Tomio is calling his book Soul on Rice. Yes. So he's doing this book, and he mentions how he talked at our SNCC 50th about how I don't know whether you can use this or not. No, don't worry about it. So anyway, he comes into SNCC through Birmingham, and he arrives in Birmingham the day that the 4 little girls are killed. He hooks up because there's a black person in where he lands who says, son, you really don't need to be around here. You need to go to this hotel and stay there because I don't know what's going to be happening. He gets there, he finds Foreman and Danny Lyon and Julian Bond, and Foreman says, and they find out that he wants to join the movement. And so Foreman says, do you have a car? And Tomio says, yeah, I got a little bug. He said, fine, you can drive us down to the national office. So from Birmingham to Atlanta. Tomio says that for the first week or so, Foreman has him sweeping the floor. And finally he gets, and for no money, by the way, because he's not even on staff at that point. Tomio says he looks at Foreman, at some point says to Foreman, you know, I really would like to do something else. And so Foreman then puts him in, I don't know whether Tomio already knew some stuff around photography. I don't remember. In any event, he then goes into photos. And so then he becomes part of the photo department. So he's down there as well. And how did I get off into photo department?
You're going to tell us about the minutes, the protest.
Oh, yeah. So all these other people, the guys are doing this other stuff, right? But none of the women, except for, you know, Mary King is working with Julian in communications, but generally, we're not going to the field. We're not doing other stuff, you know. And let me just say, I know why I shouldn't be in the field. I'm from Tarrytown, New York. I don't know anything about Southern mores, black or white. I don't know this stuff. I'm not churched. You know, it's like, please. But you got it. That's it. I still want to go to the field because that's where the action is. Okay. So.
So much for being shy and scared.
Well, I did it in my own quiet way. So we decide Foreman has gone to, I don't know if it was when he went to the UK. He goes to London for an anti-apartheid meeting at some point. And that's that whole connection that Foreman brings around the South African anti-apartheid stuff, as well as African liberation stuff in Ghana and Kenya and all that stuff. So I'm aware of all of that when I come into SNCC for the first time. But at some point, I know in my in my diary, I have that I'm going to meet Foreman coming from an international anti-apartheid meeting in London, and I'm going to meet him at the Atlanta airport, and how excited I am to hear about, you know, I'm excited to think about when I'm going to hear from him. But I don't know if that's that time, because he used to go away, you know, he'd do fundraising meetings, he'd be at the Friends of SNCC stuff. In any event, he had gone away to some meeting or fundraising party. And we decide, and I don't know how we get to this. Ruby Doris, Dinky, Mary King, and I, and it seemed to me there was a 5th person. Was somebody else in there?
In the picture,
oh, Bobby Yancey.
And Mildred.
And Mildred and Bobby Yancey.
Dinky's not in the
Dinky's not, you're right. No, she wasn't in that.
Okay.
And she wouldn't have been with Mildred, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it. Okay, so Mildred was Foreman's first wife. Okay, so you're right. It is Mildred, Mary King, Bobby Yancey, and Ruby Doris and I. And we made up little signs, little placards that said, no freedom, no minutes till something comes, freedom's something, what was it? Freedom comes.
No work till justice comes to Atlanta office.
That's it. That's right. And freedom now, you know, I mean, so we're standing up there, and he comes back from whatever, you know, he comes back into the office, and he sees us in my little area with, and we're seated on the floor with our little protest signs. And he is behind us because clearly, I think it was Danny. I'm sure it was Danny who takes this photo. So it's a staged photo, but it's after Foreman comes back and sees us sitting and
In
saying,
fact, because I think Foreman's in the back of the picture with a sign.
that's,
too.
oh, I don't remember him having a sign, but he is, that's why I was saying he's in the back, but I don't remember him having a sign, but I'm not sure about that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know that we would have let him have a sign, but I don't know about that. And I actually have a copy of that, but, we do that. Now, what's interesting about that is that when Foreman does the second edition of Making of a Black Revolutionary, in his second edition, he says that his editor, and I can't remember, she was a SNCC staff person, I can't remember who it was. No, not white female person, and I can't remember who it is. Yeah, I may or may not remember it. Anyway, says to him that he should do more on the women's liberation movement. And so he does a section, and in it he says that, this woman says, you should talk about this and talk about the sit-in in your office. And he says in this intro, so I talked to the women in the office. He said the women in the office came to me and asked me about how they could best do this, come to the attention of the men in the organization. And I suggested to them they do a sit-in in my office, says Foreman. And usually when I'm saying this, I actually have the book because I read from it. And what he says is, so I suggested they do a sit-in and that they do placards and that they do this, sit-in and it will come to the, the attention of the guys. Okay, now, he comes out with this next edition while I'm in Boston working on the second, let's see, that came out in the 80s, I guess, mid-80s. So I'm working, I think, on the first series of Eyes on the Prize, I think. And I'm reading this on the train. And I see this section, and I still have in my copy, what? And exclamation point in blue highlighter. So I get down there to the book party, and I wait till the end, and it's just he and I at the end. And he's signing my book, and I said, Foreman, what are you talking about that you suggested this sit-in? We're the ones who did this. He said, well, that's not what I remember. It's like, so what do you say behind that? It's like, now fast forward, we're at the SNCC 40th and in Jackson, and was that, I think it was at Jackson, wasn't it?
The 40th was at Duke.
Duke, was it Duke? We were at Duke, you're right. And I'm on a panel with Ivanhoe and Foreman and somebody else. And I'm sitting next to Foreman. And Foreman starts talking about this, and he looks over at me and he says, and I know that Judy has another interpretation of this. And I said, no, I have the facts. I said, but you're telling the story now, so you get to go. It's like, what? It was interesting because at the same time that this is happening, I also felt the most powerful I've ever felt. I always felt that I had no limits. That people let me do, and it really was let me, because I had no real power in this. It's like they let me do stuff that, like the residential freedom school, right? I come up with this idea after 64. Let's do a residential freedom school. Now, it means that it must have been sometime in 65, because I'd already been to Cordele, Southwest Georgia, and I'd been the staff person there. And so, anyway, I come back with this idea. And my thing was, okay, we'll get the energy of the Southern kids and the sense that you really can change things, and together with some of the young people who are associated with the Friends of SNCC offices. And so we ended up going through Monroe Sharp, who was head of the Chicago SNCC office then. And so we based it out of Chicago for the northern end, and then we were going to go back to Cordele for the southern end. We were going to do 3 weeks in one place and 3 weeks in the other. And the idea was that we would have a whole curriculum, And okay, I had this whole idea about what would happen. And the northern kids, the advantage of putting these together is that you get the energy of the southern kids, and the northern kids' reality of this is just up south. And there would be this kind of you'd have this, there's a word for that. Interaction, yes. So I come up with this idea, and I remember Ivanhoe saying to me, yeah, it's interesting. He said, why don't you put it down, let me see a draft of the proposal. Maybe I can see if I can get it funded. And he says the same thing also that Stokely says. Stokely says, yeah, let me know when you want me to come and I'll come up. Charlie says the same thing. Nobody says to me, you have never done this before in your life. What the hell do you think you're thinking of? You know, if I had been those other people, I would have said, no, we're not giving this to you, you know. Nobody says this, you know, nobody ever said this to men or women. You know, there was a sense that if it seemed like a halfway decent idea, was part of the agenda of the organization, that, you know, go for it, you know. And so Ivanhoe somehow got this funding, because I know I didn't, you know. I knew how to write a proposal, you know, or I knew I must have seen proposals written, because I certainly didn't know coming off Swarthmore's campus, you know. So I learned all this stuff in how you do this in SNCC, and I do this. But again, it was go for it, you know.
And this is Ivanhoe Donaldson and Charlie Cobb.
That's right, and Stokely Carmichael. That's right. So yeah, it was the sense of being limitless within the agenda of the organization, the philosophy of the organization. That, and if you got people to support you, I mean, you couldn't just decide to do this, you know. Clearly there was some support that had come through somewhere, probably honchoed by Ivanhoe, that had allowed me to go ahead and move with this, yeah.
I know that at a certain point you're in the Atlanta office and you participate in a couple different sit-ins.
Oh, yeah.
One's at the Tuttle House,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's another one where you get arrested and get some publicity, or you just get some publicity?
See, I got arrested several times in Atlanta demonstrations. That's the thing. So I'm not sure which one was associated with arrests, but the one, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure this one was right, the one at the Tuttle House. The Tuttle House was like a Shoney's Big Boy in Atlanta, or Wendy's. It was a restaurant chain like that, like IHOP. And so we were trying to get them to integrate. Well, that particular day, Foreman had found out that Oginga Odinga, who was at that point, I think, Foreign Affairs officer from Kenya, may have had other things, but under I think Jomo Kenyatta. And so, you know, this is newly independent Kenya, and so he's this high-ranking diplomat, and he's now in Atlanta. And Foreman finds out, because Foreman really kept aware, you know, was very much aware of the international relations part when it came to African affairs and, African affairs. So he finds out Oginga Odinga is going to be staying at the Peachtree Manor, which had only a year before been integrated. Because it was that whole thing about, you know, Atlanta, the city too busy to hate, and, you know, it had become really embarrassing for the federal government in this Cold War time for these newly African nations to send diplomats into the South, and they couldn't eat at restaurants, right? Really bad publicity, particularly because this was a time when Russia really was major. It's a major force. It's the Cold War. This country wants these newly independent African countries to go onto the side of the United States and not on the side of Russia. So how the U.S. looked with all of this horrible, you know, segregation and stuff, was a black eye. And of course, Russia was taking, you know, as Vestia would put headlines when the Birmingham bombing, church bombing, everything. Okay. On top of which, the African diplomats are driving down Route 40 before there's a Highway 95. And Route 40 was the direct line between New York City, their chanceries, and the embassies in Washington, D.C. So they would come down they would not be able, once they left, really, once they hit Delaware, they couldn't really, and actually they couldn't have eaten even in Chester, Pennsylvania, because Chester, Pennsylvania was segregated too. But they get down and they can't stop anywhere, right? So the U.S. is really, the federal government is not happy, you know, and so that whole line of particularly Route 40 and then going into Atlanta is not looking good. So